it so we can get started and finish our discussion today on time. So welcome. So first of all, I would like to warmly welcome you to this session on de-risking instruments to catalyze private sector-led e-bus adoption. You've heard a lot this morning, and for those of you who might have been around yesterday for the climate finance roundtable, quite a lot of discussion is how do we raise the funding to support the transition, and this one is going to focus primarily on electric buses. So my name is Binyam Reja. I'm the Global Practice Manager. First, let me welcome our panelists to the podium. So Dr. Qureshi, Additional Secretary for in India, Ministry of Heavy Industries, Dr. Senia, Advisor in the National Institute of Transforming India, NITI Ayong, I think is what's called. And then we have Mr. Felipe also from Sao Paulo Municipality, Finance Secretary. It's great that you're able to join us, Felipe, for this discussion. And we have Vinay from the US government. Please join us. And then finally, my colleague Jessica from IFC. Please join. So we still have one more person, hopefully will join. Oh, you're here. Okay, because we were looking for you. Come on. Huh? Okay, because we almost gave up on you. And our colleague Reda is from the French Development Agency, AFD by its French acronym. Okay, so today's discussion is going to be about getting investment for electric buses. But just to give you a little bit of a context, and the challenge that we really are trying to address here is that generally public transportation system in many countries are not a money-making exercise. So here we are saying now we want to increase investment in electric buses, and because many of our governments, especially when you go down to local governments, they're hugely fiscally constrained. So they cannot really invest on a modern public transportation system that could actually provide effective and inclusive, accessible bus system. And yet we're also now being called to respond to climate challenges, and how do they get into that? So the starting point is that many of our local governments are fiscally constrained, so really, let alone to do high investment on very expensive electric buses, they're not even able to manage their system, even within the normal buses. Then the second starting point is in many of our cities and many developing countries, the vast majority of the buses are individually owned by individual owners, informal transport, and those are also very difficult to get capital investment into them. So I guess the challenge now we have is how do we create a financing mechanism that can actually then provide a safe, dependable public transportation system that doesn't actually then kill the government's fiscal system. So this is really kind of multiple challenges that we're trying to solve. So we're trying to minimize the burden on the fiscal system. We're trying to ensure that private sector comes in and they invest at a for small return or at a very minimal return, if you will. So within this context, we're really super happy to have people who are practitioners and who have been doing on this space. So we're going to hear from India, from Brazil, Reda, maybe a bit on Africa context, but feel free to also do. So we'll hear from governments, and then from private sector's role, IFC, and then the role of the philanthropy. So I'm going to maybe start here, and I'll ask Dr. Senya, if you can give us a little bit the context how the public transportation system in India is really working now, and how you're starting from where you have a dominance of a publicly operated transportation system with minimal capital expenditure, with fiscally constrained. How are you trying to what are the policy levers that you're putting in place so that those local governments are engaging with the private sector to invest in public transport? Over to you.
Thank you, Ben. So well, in India, we have got 2.1 million buses. That is what the bus strength is. Out of that, 250,000 buses, they are into the public stream. So for the public transport, regardless whether it is run by the private or the public, 250,000 buses are there. Rest, all of them are private kind of captive buses, school buses, and all those things. Out of these 250,000 buses that we have, 150,000 of them are run by the government undertakings. So state public sector undertakings, state public transport undertakings, they are the ones which are running them. So what we could establish is we have got a scheme, FAME, as it was mentioned in the morning also. So FAME scheme supports the buses. It also supports the charging infrastructure for the buses. So be it upstream charging infrastructure or else it supports buses. So what we could do is when we went in for a rejig of FAME 2, we decided that in 2021, the decision was taken that we would be focusing on only 9 cities of India, where the population is 4 million plus, so that we could create lighthouse cities. And these buses will be primarily the intra-city public transport buses. So we did go for that. And we aggregated the demand. A set of interventions were, they were clustered in. So aggregation of demand was one thing. We also harmonized the specifications. We asked each one of them, each of these parties, that what is precisely your demand? What kind of buses do you require? And we always put the OEMs along with us. And the first bid was 5,450 buses. That bid was very successfully carried out. What we could establish after that bid was that these buses on OPEX model, these electric buses turned out to be cheaper as compared to the diesel one. So the prices slashed down by say 25 to 40%. That was the slash down of the prices. So now it was established beyond doubt that if buses are on OPEX model, operating expenditure model, then the best is electric. So that was kind of established one. But the problem was that all these buses continued to be in the book of assets of the OEM. So OEM, after all, they can't take they can't make their own shelf so heavy. So this was some sort of leasing, you can call it. So that is how it was floated forward. There are other than FAME, other interventions are also there. So there is a PM e-bus seva, where other than intra-city buses are also being supported. Plus, we went beyond these 4 million plus cities, the smaller ones, and that is being supported. Our National Electric Bus Program, which is an aspirational program, the aim is to position 50,000 electric buses. And there is another kind of convening that is going on, that with respect to a bigger set of buses which are owned by private people, how can we mobilize finances, Ben, for them? And what de-risking instruments could be initiated? So that is another understanding which is going on. And my sense is that 50,000 is the number that we propose to reach very fast. And when it comes to hundreds of thousands, so the idea is 800,000, that is what the big number is. So let's see, of course, that would require tremendous amount of interventions, ramping up the capacity of the manufacturers, setting up the supply chain, a lot of very intimate interaction with agencies like, well, I'm sitting here, so maybe World Bank, US government, and multiple kind of agencies, they'll have to work to pull it through. Yes.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sinha. So basically what you're saying is you combine the capex and the operating costs into one concession, and then whoever the concessionaire then gets paid on an annual or monthly basis over the concession period. So in other words, the transport authority that's concessioning this doesn't have to come forward. So my question is...
So Ben, just half a minute on it. So what we said was that, okay, these buses will be for a period of this contractual agreement will be for a period of 12 years.
12 years, okay.
So the prices are fixed for 12 years.
Okay.
Number two, it would be in a way, it would be a kind of, these were the driver, the cleaner, the entire maintenance, battery change, everything is to be done by the person who is owning the bus. And the authorities will have to pay per kilometer. And whichever OEM, locks in the least amount per kilometer, they would be the one who will win the bid.
Okay, so no, that's great. But then a lot of private sector would be very hesitant to get into that because they have to wait over a 12 year to get their money back. So this risk, whether it's real or perceived risk, how are you handling it? How is maybe Dr. Qureshi? Can you maybe elaborate a little bit from the government's point of view, how you are able to de-risk this investment and get all these OEMs and private sector to invest in this public transportation system?
Thank you. So as Sudhendu Sinha ji said that out of the 2.2 million buses which India has, about 150,000 are operated by the government, where a payment security mechanism has been announced by the President Biden and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And this payment security mechanism will ensure that these 50,000 buses which are operated by the government, they roll out by 2027. The other part which you talked about is the private buses, which is a fragmented market, where more than 26,000 operators, they own less than 5 buses each. And the question is, how can those buses be electrified? Now, to begin, I'd just like to play a small video about the payment security mechanism. Lagu, if you can start that.
Yeah, so we will show you a bit of a video how the risk mitigation works. So
हर इंडिविजुअल को प्रो क्लाइमेट, प्रो एनवायरमेंट अपना जीवन जीने का तरीका डेवलप करना होगा.
We're demonstrating once more how India and the United States are collaborating on tackling climate crisis we face.
As a part of this strategic agreement, the leaders of 2 of the world's largest democracies decided to strengthen their partnership on the decarbonization of the transportation sector through electrification. Their key focus was to accelerate India's national electric bus program. This Government of India initiative envisioned 50,000 made in India electric buses on the road by 2027, which would need investments of over $10 billion. While 12,000 e-buses have already been deployed, there was a need felt to accelerate greater private sector investment. To address delays in payment by public transport agencies to e-bus operators and to strengthen state governments financially for procurement of e-buses, India and the US have collaborated to create an innovative payment security mechanism, or PSM. This PSM will make the e-bus project more bankable and credit-worthy, enabling private sector investments to flow in, thereby facilitating a faster deployment of electric buses, contributing to India's commitment of achieving net zero emissions by 2070. Thus, fulfilling the dream of a cleaner, greener planet that gives our children pure, breathable air and a happier future. This unique PSM will provide a replicable model for countries worldwide to decarbonize their public transport sector. India and the US, together with the world, working tirelessly to save our planet.
Yeah, so now the electrification of buses in the government sector, that is the difficult part of the whole picture. And that is what is aided by the payment security mechanism, because the OEMs are now comfortable that they will be getting their payments throughout the 10 years. So they are more willing to invest into manufacturing and invest into supplying the buses. Now for the private sector, buses which are operating, we need to establish the charging infrastructure. We are talking about identifying high density corridors where the buses will be running. Already the buses are running in India in electric buses in high density corridors like Delhi Jaipur or Delhi Chandigarh, Bombay Pune. The objective of the government is to identify those routes and establish charging infrastructure there, which also will be financed by the private sector. So how to make establishing the charging infrastructure a viable business so that private capital come in there. For that, de-risking is required. And for that, we are talking with several financial institutions, including SIDBI and others. So that is the way we have planned. And also one concern is that the components which go into making of the electric buses, the cells, the advanced chemistry cells, there's a separate Government of India program which encourages the manufacture of cells within India. And also the other components which go into making, be it electronics or be it the other components, they also, the downstream ecosystem of manufacturing supply chain needs also to be strengthened. So once that system is strengthened and there is work on the charging infrastructure, then private capital find it easier to invest into the buses and then fly. Yeah.
Okay, very well. Thank you. So essentially what you both are describing is really working on the ecosystem approach from charging facility and working with the OEMs and getting all this. Now you're moving to the private sector where, you don't really have a depot where you can put the charging facility, but now you also corridor long distance charging. So let's see how then that response that reflects in, let's say, São Paulo in Brazil. So Luis, São Paulo is also a big city, a major city, and Brazil, of course, is also a big country, not to the size of India, but you do have at least critical mass. How are you trying to electrify the buses? We heard from the India example, they're looking at combining CapEx and OpEx and a leasing model, and also working in different ecosystem in the different value chain. Does that resonate with you in São Paulo? Are there other ways of also achieving this?
Thank you, Ben. First of all, I'd like to thank for the invitation. It's truly an honor to be here debating this important topic with you. In São Paulo, we're going for an alternative route. We believe that electrical buses have shown already that they are viable from an engineering point of view. The challenge now is to show that they are viable financially also. We feel that that is kind of the classical cash flow problem. We know that we have an asset that brings us some economy in operational costs, and that may be a viable investment if we have the money in low interests to do this investment. The problem is now we have a lot of uncertainties. We have high risks, and that elevates the interest rates. So to make this investment, we have to pay a lot for the capital. there is a problem. That is a problem for us. So the challenge is, how can we de-risk this project in order to lower the capital cost and to make this investment profitable? We believe that the government has some role to play here. And in São Paulo, what we are trying to deliver is a project in which we may capture the efficiencies of the private sector with the lower capital costs of the public sector. And we're trying to do this by capitalizing, leveraging the good financial stance that the city of São Paulo has at this moment. And what we're trying to do is to use public budget and also loan agreements that the city is signing in order to subsidize the investment in the electrical buses. Not the full investment, because we also feel that we have efficiencies when you have the assets, when you have the ownership of the assets with the same operator. The history in São Paulo of the system shows us that. So we are choosing at this moment a path in which we concentrate the ownership of the assets with this operation, but we subsidize the investment, not the full investment, but the difference between the price of the diesel fuel buses and the electrical buses. We believe that by doing this, we may de-risk the investment at this moment. We may, by doing this, lower the cost of capital for these concessionary companies. We may unlock private investments, and we may, by doing this, allow for these investments in this moment where the uncertainties are still high. And we believe that in the next years, probably that step will allow us to have lower prices, will allow us to have lower uncertainties, and then the private sector may come with more capital and lower interests.
Very good. Excellent description of what's happening in Brazil. So I like the way you framed it. We want to use the borrowing capability of the government, Sao Paulo in this case, and then the efficiency of the private sector, and marrying the two is obviously a very nice way. And then you're also, from your subsidy point of view, it is the increment, the delta between a diesel bus and an electric bus is what you're. So I guess maybe this is a question to Reda. How is, so, you know, the French Development Agency is kind of bilateral or even an MDB. How do you see it? How would you support, let's say, a government to de-risk an investment in e-bus? What are you seeing, especially, let's say, in Africa or other countries that you're working on?
Okay, thank you, Binyam, and very pleased to be here. Maybe assuming already that there is, I would say, a conducive institutional, regulatory, political framework and policy framework for both public transportation and electrification, which is a strong assumption. Then we can work on maybe like allowing de-risking. Maybe we can discuss later about the overall framework, but let's say about de-risking. As it's been said, e-buses are still, more expensive upfront. I think this will change over time, but they are still, and the risk perception is still higher from an investor perspective, which leads with the capex also a higher cost potentially of financing, a higher risk perception, etc. So I think on a DFI point of view, we have to work on both levels. First, I would say investment gap funding. I mean, we have to come up with concessional finance, blended finance to fund. I would say the whether capex gap or the TCO gap. So, for instance, as AFD, we have been provided a credit line to the National Development Bank of Colombia, FDN, so they can relend with very low interest rate to secondary cities that want to finance e-buses. Or another example is that we do blended finance, including with our partner from the European Union, where we blend grants for incremental capex. An example which is not buses, but it's e-boats. In Nigeria, we came up with 60 million euro grant to finance charging infrastructure, adaptation of the grid, and incremental capex for e-boats, Laguna boats in Lagos. So this is to, I would say, lower the cost of capital. And then you have de-risking, because I think the new business models that allow, separating the asset ownership and the risk, the commercial risk of operation might be very conducive, because then e-buses comes desirable assets for climate finance, for impact investors, etc. And we are able to provide maybe new de-risking instruments. So it's been said, of course, public payment guarantee. For instance, in AFD, we're able to provide public payment guarantee to municipalities, or covering the risk of municipalities. So this we do for renewable energy, for instance, or sub-sovereign entities, and we could definitely do the same with, a planned yield of rents, which will cover the asset ownership of the buses.
Okay, very well. So basically, when a country doesn't really have an OEM where you can just go to the OEM and say, okay, we need you guys to come up and lease, they still have to pre-finance. The transit agency has to import or to buy. So in a way, what AFD is doing is providing the upfront financing or pre-financing the purchase or the procurement of buses, and then they get repaid somehow.
Yeah, exactly. So Proparco, which is branch financing the private sector within AFD, did that in recently with both concession of Bogota. So we've been financing the private sponsors that invested into buses, and then are covering an annual fee just to own, maintain the buses, and eventually provide the power provision. Also in Dakar, same Proparco has been financing. So it's been, we talked about Dakar BRT, but they are financing Meridiam, so the sponsor for the purchase of buses. Here with a different risk profile, because that will cover, both operation and bus ownership. But there is a traffic risk guarantee from the government.
Very well. So now I'm going to come to Vinaya. So you're hearing quite a lot of models that are being employed in terms of getting investment in buses, de-risking during operation phase, but there's also the upfront financing that has to happen in terms of then reducing the capital cost. From where you stand in terms of working as a bilateral agency, providing primarily grant to developing countries, what is the best way of using grant financing so that the private sector can come and invest? What are the experiences you're seeing, and how would you advise our developing countries?
Well, thank you, Ben, for that question. And thank you to the World Bank and WRI for hosting today and tomorrow's events. And for the audience that's come, you sometimes take for granted when you get excited talking about transportation and buses that you have practitioners among yourself that are just as excited. Usually in cocktail conversation, this isn't as exciting of a topic. So thank you for coming and listening and participating. I would say the question you raised, Ben, is what creates a struggle for me. Is there, if you want to create a rinse and repeat model, do you insist that the model always be one way? In the case of India and the work we did there, and this is specifically talking about the use of grant dollars, you have relatively a high threshold. You want to try and get sort of three major things accomplished. One is if you're going to use grant dollars, for us, USAID especially, and then philanthropy. And in the case here, we put together about $150 million of grant money, most of it from philanthropy, some from the US government. And the Indian government came in with about 250. So we have this $400 million escrow account, which essentially allows the OEMs, as Mr. Sinha and Dr. Qureshi were describing, allows the OEMs to borrow on a non-recourse basis from the banks so that they can be the leasing company and create SPVs. So with $400 million in an escrow account, you've essentially unlocked at $200,000 a bus, and at 50,000 buses, $10 billion in non-recourse lending. And so you get a large leverage, which I think is one key thing you need. You get a development impact because it's a public bus and it's public use, and it's pursuing something around the ideas of less consumption and climate benefit on greenhouse gas emissions, savings and carbon savings. And then the third thing you want to get is you want to prime it for large scale investment, for the DFIs to come in and then private investment to come in. In this case, it allows for banks to do non-recourse lending, but as we move forward on things like charging infrastructure and private buses, we feel like we've set up a model primarily led by the Indian government that allows us to continue. And I would say, for me, what I struggle with is if I get somewhat religious about the model, I would say there was about 4 or 5 things that work. And do we have to insist on that in every other market? One is transportation as a service. As some of the other folks mentioned, you've sort of separated asset ownership from operation. So you've defrayed the capital expenditure of a new asset, often more expensive than a diesel bus, and you made it a lease payment. And that's why the payment security mechanism works, because you're providing that offtake guarantee. To go large scale and to bring in more investment, is that a fundamental concept or requirement that you need? Or if we'd like to work more with Brazil, where you can't separate the two due to the environment, is there a way to work and still go large scale? Two, I think, and what the Secretary of Finance in Sao Paulo talked about is the demand side subsidy, which has brought in investment and covering the difference between the diesel and the e-bus, which India did as well, to the FAME agreements that Mr. Sinha talked about. But then over time is become less and less necessary because of the third component, which is demand aggregation. And again, in some other markets, we may not be able to get that. In India, a country of 1.6 billion, 2-point-something million vehicles, you can get demand aggregation. But should we, if we go to other markets as donors, insist on some form of demand aggregation? Should we, working with IFC, MDBs, insist on countries coming together and demand aggregating so that they can drive down the price of e-buses to less than 200,000? And then the last 2 things I'll just say quickly is, one is political will. I think that made a huge difference here. You saw it in the video. It's the aspirations set out. The Secretary of Finance said, provide in Brazil, it's setting clarity of how many buses you want to do a year. That sort of makes a huge difference for any investor, I think. And we had that in the case of India. And the last thing is, I think we kept it very simple. In the payment security mechanism, we kept it government. We actually didn't use blended finance. It's all sort of grant money, which unlocks private investment. But as we move forward, I think we see opportunities for blended finance, but it allowed us to execute. But I think the one question I'm left with is, do we insist that all of those things happen in additional markets? Or do you find ways, if you want to rinse and repeat and move quickly, or do you have to, of course, work at a country level, but sometimes if you get too deviated from your model, then it's hard. It takes a long time to get to what we often talk about at places like COP around acceleration, agility, and scale. Thanks, Ben.
No, thank you, Vinaya. Those are really excellent points and a good summary of the lessons, which I think are broadly applicable. Yes, you have to fit them into your country's circumstance, institutional circumstance, and the depth of the financial sector, as you will. So is also quite important. And many countries do not have the financial system to actually support long-term borrowing. And that's why we have IFC, basically, then to come in and provide the financing. So, Jessica, I heard different models. The repeated work is de-risking and risk. From where you stand in IFC and with the clients you work in, what is it that they're saying? How would they be able to come into this space and really accelerate the adoption of e-buses in many of the developing countries where, in fact, the economic case is already there? You can save on operating costs. You have tremendous amount of climate benefits, but without the financing structuring or the funding behind it, many are reluctant. So please, from your point of view,
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me to the panel as well, Ben, and the rest of the World Bank Group colleagues. And it's nice to come at the end of the esteemed panel because I have the benefit of hearing all of the comments, and I can attest that each of these efforts that everyone on the panel has described is very important to enable the final private sector financing to flow into this segment. We know that the interest is there from the entrepreneurs. They've been watching this and seeing this potential. For quite a number of years. The OEMs have been looking to adapt technology and have been doing so, attracting capital, mainly equity investment for a number of years. We've seen huge efforts on the part of the Indian government in structuring the vision, the regulatory environment, and starting to support early initiatives like FAME. But one aspect that hasn't been mentioned that I thought I would pull out is the importance of the master concession agreement and the work that was done for years during COVID when many of us were trapped at home. But it's where we spent the bulk of our efforts because we knew how important it would be to have a standard concession contract and aggregation model. So while it's so important that the tendering is being aggregated and it can attract the volume of investment that a lot of the DFIs and MDBs would need to be working at, but that the contract itself would be bankable and that model could be replicated not only in the biggest city, for example, in the country, but also in the many cities throughout the country that would need to be doing e-bus tendering. So having that consistency in contracting is critical for the financial investors who come in, both on the developer side and those who would be financing them, because it's an extremely burdensome process to be looking concession by concession at what are the similarities, what are the differences, what are the gaps that need to be filled. And we've talked too, as well as the need for de-risking in the early days where lenders as a group were a hesitant and cautious bunch, I'll say for myself. My kids can attest, but we look at risks and we look at new sectors, new technologies, and particularly the ones that haven't been tried on a large scale. And we say, what if? What could happen? What could go wrong? And we need to see by demonstration that things are going to work. So putting a lot of the support, the payment security mechanism is critical to watch what will be the impact, how will these contracts be treated, what will be the payment profiles of the public transport authorities, how will these work? And hopefully with great experience, these enhancements get taken off because they're truly not needed. But it's really the confidence that's needed to attract investment capital in the early days. And I will say one idea is, I think India has done well, is replicating in the early days of the National Solar Mission, where you did a similar approach and with capital that was supported as well by other investment partners. But building a model that hadn't been done, it hadn't been tested before, having a bit of a backstop to give investors confidence. When it was proven that it could work without that, the sector goes off on its own and becomes more and more economically viable over time. So I can't stress enough, the amount of importance on aggregation, on standardization of process, on replication, particularly then using this model to take to other environments that could work, or the Brazil model that's coming in, but trying to do things on as much rinse and repeat as possible so that we don't have to continue and learn for each new environment, each jurisdiction, which adds time and makes it very complicated. So all of these efforts are very welcome and are very encouraging for us now to come in and invest in the sector.
Great. And thank you, Jessica. I think the point is, even when we work in a kind of regional approach, different countries, even when we talk about aggregation, it doesn't have to be always, like there is this master head guy that's procuring all the buses a la India, but having that standardized document, a standardized specification, that's kind of a proxy for the aggregation that we want. So because it sends powerful market signals, but because you're not going to get, even I think in India you were successful to aggregate it at the central level. I don't know how you convinced your local governments to cede that authority, but even in a big country, local governments, that's the one to do. Even here in the US is also going, but that I think working on standardization as a way of aggregation is a good way to go. I'm going to invite perhaps our esteemed audience maybe to come stretch your legs and ask questions to our great panel here. you have to come here to the microphone. Please introduce yourself and the organization you work in, and then point to your question.
Hello, I'm Bianca from C40 Cities. My question is around one of the main challenges on the sector, which is the residual value. So as the battery is around 50% of the bus price, how are you foreseeing or considering the secondary market of the batteries, as it has a huge impact on the financial modeling?
Good point. Maybe Dr. Qureshi or Mr. Sanhaya.
Yeah, that's an important point. So batteries, we see that there is a second market for batteries also in industrial uses and inverters. The earlier diesel generators were used. So a lot of batteries used in EVs can be used there. That is one. And second is that the recycling of batteries, that market is there. In India, the size of the reused batteries is not so large that the economies of scale can be achieved. But once the large number of batteries come, I think those companies who do recycling and extract the minerals out of that, they would come into play. So certainly we need to do more work on that.
You didn't include it in your financial model? It's not included.
That's not included in their financial model. That's right. But the 10 years agreement, which is there, or 12 years with the state governments, that includes the cost of the battery. So for 12 years, the operators would provide the transportation as a service. And that will include battery as well as any other components, whatever is required.
But it's for the operator. Sorry, just to delve into the question there, because I don't know the answer myself. So the operator who's bidding, whether it's the OEM or in the case of Brazil, the operator has to incorporate the costs of what they're going to do with the battery after 10 or 12
They have to incorporate it.
And they'll have to determine how they model that.
That's right.
Also, the risk of the battery, who takes it? I guess it's the operator.
Maybe just to add to that, on the models, we're starting to see the developers have included that cost after a number of years. They're doing very sophisticated route modeling to determine which routes require how many number of years and for which usage. But they have built in this cost into the financial models. And it's interesting from a lender perspective, it's one of the risks that you would like to see that money may be set aside so that as and when the time would be needed for that replacement, that it would be there. So that's, kind of a standard structuring approach that we would have taken on many different infrastructure segments.
So Ben, if I could just add what Dr. Qureshi said. So yes, you rightly pointed out that the resale value, identifying the resale value is a major challenge. So I'm aware that, for example, in Germany, there are set companies, set authorities, which are in a position to identify the resale value. And that has got a lot of respect, has got a lot of credibility. Resale value is equally important for the financial agencies to have that comfort. So in India, what we have we have started, of course, Dr. Saraswati is leading it. So we are setting up a technical committee with the participation of the bankers and it's a multiple stakeholders are there, where we would set out protocols and the principles how to identify the resale value. But yes, resale value are not identified by mathematical formula that grows and evolves with the growth of secondary market. Yes.
Yes, São Paulo.
Yes, São Paulo. I believe the question has two parts, and both have been commented. The first part is how do you deal with the environmental risk and the waste cost management of waste after the end of the lifespan of the asset? And in São Paulo, we have established by contract that the operator must fulfill and comply with all the Brazilian rules for the management of this waste after the lifespan of the asset, which are very strict. And the second part of the question, and I believe that maybe that was the main question, actually, is how do you deal with the residual value of the not fully amortized asset after the end of the term of the concession? And in São Paulo, what we are doing is that we are considering that this not amortized value is somewhat like new revenue for the concessionary after the end of the contract, and we are making a discount in remuneration due to this value that after the end of the contract is in the hand of the concessionary company.
But wouldn't you expect that the concession period would be generally longer than the life of the battery? Because usually, I think that's the risk that I guess as a lender I would see, because that would rather than having a residual value and what to do with that unamortized.
Yeah, that will depend on at what point of the concession will the asset be purchased. And that's why we believe that we will have to, every year of the concession, to reassess all these variables. And that is linked to the fact that we are in an uncertainty environment that contributes to the need of a government approach for the problem also.
Yeah, I guess in the case of São Paulo, just to clarify, because you're working on an existing concession period.
Yes, exactly.
Limited time, so you do have that issue. But in general, how do you address that risk, Reda? You want to say something?
Yeah, maybe answering with an example. So in Bogota concession, so the concession period is 15 years, and globally the assessment is that the battery lifespan is 8 years. So you have to replace it once. And so what Proparco has been doing is providing a delayed draw loan, which allows from year one to forecast all the cash flows related to the loan, which will happen 8 years after. So this is financial structuring that allows to have, the serials of cash flow today in 8 years. So that's, of course, has a cost of financial structuring itself, but it provides, it's de-risking, it provides certainty to the sponsor, and then they can model, etc., etc. Then just I wanted to mention about the residual value of batteries, that it's not only a negative externality, it has also a usage. Of course, it's very important for the grid resilience, it's potentially storage, stationary use, and on that, from my knowledge, how the market will value that in 8 years is very uncertain. It's more of a potential premium for the battery owner than anything else.
Yeah. Okay, please.
Thank you. Tinus Boysen from Stellenbosch University in South Africa. One aspect that has fortunately just came up that I want to ask about is in the transition of going from a few electric buses to 2 million buses. You are obviously at some point, don't know much about India's grid, but you're at some point going to hit the limits of what the grid can support in terms of electric buses. Us in South Africa, we actually have outages every day. So we are in this catch-22 of providing more electric buses means less electricity, and it means mobility is affected by the grid, but also the grid affects mobility. How do you manage that risk in the financing? And would it not make sense to couple them closer in setting up the finance so that it's provided as a system, electricity and the mobility?
Yes, so integration with the grid. Let's hear from India first. Then we go.
So, you rightly said that grid stability becomes a challenge. So in India, the Ministry of Power has launched a specific program. It is called Revamped Distribution System Scheme, RDSS. So it's a massive program. It's almost close to $40+ billion program is there, where the money is being given to the state distribution companies to strengthen their grid systems, taking into account the future requirements, multiple requirements, including that of the electric vehicles. So that is what is precisely being done, because we are aware that it would require transformers, it would require heavy density cables, it might require as well as the new substations. So that is being taken care of.
And to add to Mr. Sinha, that most buses charge at night time, because daytime they are doing the operations. So one thing which the Ministry of Power has done to introduce a time of day metering, where the power during the night time is expensive by 15 to 20%, and in the daytime it is cheaper, because India intends to make 50% grid energy renewable by 2030. So there's a lot of solar power in the day. So to encourage them to use it, so that's also one way it will be managed.
So do you see any kind of innovation on supplying the power? We see, for example, in some places, solar panel are used in the depot to actually directly support the Dakar BRT is trying to do that. Also, yesterday we heard actually in the 2-3-wheeler space, the rural electrification can actually be supported by electric two-wheelers because of the demand that they generate, making the investment more financially viable. What are you seeing in terms of innovations there?
So actually, in 2-3 wheelers, I think the demand still can be managed because the load is small. But when it comes to buses or trucks, then the load is huge. And there, one of the issues is that solar power is a low density power, and you cannot have enough solar panels to power a electric bus charging station. So the concept of the RPOs, which is there in India, renewable purchase obligation. So utilities must purchase that much amount of renewable power, and they can source it from somewhere else. And interstate transmission of solar power is at a very concessional rates. No additional duties are. So small states like perhaps Goa, which do not have adequate solar power, they can get solar power from other states. So that's how the solar will be managed through the national grid.
Yeah, I would note it's a very interesting question from South Africa. We spent some time working with Eskom and the government there. And I think if you look at Brazil and India, one thing you have there is transmission has been privatized to a certain degree. And South Africa is still struggling with that question and going through it, and legislation's in front there. But if you were able to open up transmission, and this may be much more sort of too free market thinking or pressing that point, but you'd be able to get power from the Cape, as you well know, and then move it in and then be able to. So in a place like South Africa, coupling the two might make more sense. And this is the challenge I said before. If you sort of insist on one model, it may not work in every country. And there, as you point out, more technical assistance and integrating e-mobility and grid may make more sense. Whereas in Brazil and India, where it's been decoupled and deregulated, it's not as much necessary.
But Vinay, just to clarify, that transmission is still with the government. Distribution has been privatized in many places. So what India has done is the Power Grid Corporation of India, which runs the national grid. They have made transmission of renewable power over long distances to be free of cost. So now states can get power from wherever. So that's how they integrated.
Yeah, so you have more independent power producers, and then the distribution at the end is privately or locally provided, so you can deal with them. But I think what I want to push the point is, can we actually use this EV transition, electric mobility, to incentivize more renewable energy? Can it actually be the driver in some places where we can see more energy coming in?
Yes, I believe that we have this opportunity. Let me take Brazil's example. We have 85% of energy sources in Brazil that are renewable. The last decades, investments in power generation in Brazil increased way faster pace than demand for energy in Brazil. And what we see now is that we have a huge opportunity, because in Brazil, if we invest in electrical mobility, we are actually reducing emissions. We are not just changing where the emission is occurring. We're changing actually the source of the energy. And that is a huge opportunity from where I see, because we have this capacity. We definitely, in São Paulo's project, we do not reach the roof of the power generation capacity. Maybe if we go national, we don't have the scale of India, of course, but we still have more than 100,000 buses nationwide, and maybe we'll have to do some investments, but probably the capacity of the grid will not be a problem for the implementation of electrical buses in Brazil.
Very well. So we have a couple minutes left for this. There's one more question over there.
My name is Frahiwat. Thank you so much for the nice discussion, but I have a very simple question. So how do we bring the political will when there is a very conflicting demand for the use of the limited resource. So India, as a federal country, have this one master document, but how do we encourage governments to invest on the e-initiative when there is so many conflicting demands, especially in developing countries? That's my question. Thank you.
Very good. I think that's a good question to start asking you, all policymakers.
And it appears to be simple, but it's very difficult, you see.
Well, the question
What
is
she
simple,
wants to know
but
is,
the answer is hard. Yeah.
She wants to know is that how to, encourage the political will kind of things.
Yeah.
So we might as well go for electrification, but it has to be at the top. So, well, in India, if I might say, that we have got NITI Aayog is there, National Institution for Transforming India, which is supposed to be, it gives in addition to many other things, it also gives heads up to the Prime Minister. I mean, that is there. And we have Dr. Saraswat leading so many initiatives in storage. For example, he is developing standards for stationary storage in India. What should be the standards? And that standard should be chemistry agnostic kind of standards. So many things are there. As we have got years of the political leadership. So we are, in a way, it acts like in US what they say, the brain trust. So we might as well give them some ideas, and quite at times, it's taken up. And that is precisely, I would say, but then how to encourage the political leadership will be really.
Well, Vinaya, you had mentioned in your opening, political will is important.
Yeah.
Now the question is, how do you get that?
And I think as donors or partners, we have technical assistance money and support that we can offer. But here I would offer a contrarian answer that I think we may have more impact if this is a Global South solution led by the Global South. So I would encourage a lot of Global South engagement. Our engagement with India now is, and in Brazil leading in the Western Hemisphere. How can you take your example and work with countries in your region, and maybe we can help on the margins, but really become sort of a South-South solution, and I would encourage that, I think.
I mean, maybe just to give some encouragement too, a lot of what I see in my role, and I'm an investment professional doing just e-mobility primarily, we see a lot of private business opportunities that are coming forward in countries where the governments have done very little, if nothing, to encourage investment in electric mobility. But because of the total cost of ownership that's been described, the economies of the technology, when they're put into heavy use, the economics are there. So we're seeing private investment opportunities coming where operators are switching. They're asking to switch voluntarily because they will be saving money. And then additionally, you have sets of investors whose shareholders want to decarbonize. So that's another added incentive. But the economics of the business model are there. So it's much more helpful to have the government to help to speed the transition. But the good news is it's happening already in many, many locations without, a very well organized government support.
Reda?
Yeah, maybe one more. I mean, regardless of the electrification process, I think you said it. I mean, running buses is not a profit-making business. It hasn't been historically. I think we have to continue our efforts to advocate for public transportation, its attractiveness, its intermodality with non-motorized transport, walking, cycling, and the shape of our cities. I think one of the binding constraints is the preparedness and attractiveness of the public transportation system itself. And of course, e-buses are potentially desirable assets for public authorities, for investors, but the public transport the public transport system has to be ready institutionally, etc. So we have to really keep on our efforts with a people-centric approach. People has to see the benefits of that, so it can really be scaled up. Thank you.
No, thank you all. I think we've come to the end of the session. Unfortunately, we will have to ask that question at a coffee break, and you can come up here. But just to close here, I think the takeaway for me is e-buses is possible in developing countries. There are many business models that we can use. Private sector is ready to invest. Policy support, incentives are still crucial. You can't do this without it. but that doesn't have to break the bank of the government. I think we are operating in a fiscally constrained environment. Many countries are in high debt, but there is still, if we can get the standardization right, the policy right, we can get private sector to invest on this e-bus system. And then if we also get some grant funding to sweeten the deal, or to de-risk the investment, that is all that we can say. So thank you all for sharing your experience and your knowledge. And let's give them a round of